Sir Richard Peto. Sir Richard Peto es actualmente profesor de Estadística Médica y Epidemiología en la Universidad de Oxford y codirector de la Unidad de Servicio de Ensayo Clínico y la Unidad de Estudios Epidemiológicos. Fue nombrado miembro de la Royal Society of London en 1989 por introducir el metaanálisis de ensayos aleatorios. Fue nombrado caballero por la reina Isabel en 1999 por sus servicios a la epidemiología. Recibió en 2010 y 2011 el Cancer Research United Kingdom y el Lifetime Achievement Award. Richard Peto, Rory Collins y otros en el Oxford Clinical Trial Service Unit aumentaron sustancialmente la importancia estimada de los lípidos en la sangre, la presión arterial y el tabaquismo como causas de muerte prematura. Demos una gran bienvenida en este escenario a Sir Richard Peto.
I've put references on many of them, and there was a one-page article which summarises what I want to say, and then if that's interesting, then there's a 14-page article which gives more details. Okay, now, if you want to avoid death before old age, you've got to do two things. You've got to avoid death in childhood, and you've got to avoid death when actually in early adult life, and death in middle age. And I think we need to consider three separate age ranges because the causes are so different. So it doesn't really matter where you make the splits, but death in early childhood, death, say, in early adult life, and death in middle age. Now, it really doesn't matter whether I put that cut point at age 35, at age 30, at age 40, or at age 50. The causes of death among people in their 50s and 60s, the cancer, the strokes, heart attacks, are very different from the causes of death in early adult life, HIV, violence, and from the causes of death in childhood. So we need to consider three age ranges separately, rather than mixing everything together. And so when I say, can we halve premature death, I want to say, can mortality be halved in each of these age ranges? And I think the answer is yes, and I'll try to explain why. But first, I want to look at the changes that have taken place over the last 100 years. I want to look at the changes that have taken place over the last 40 years, and then maybe even discuss some of the changes that have taken place this century, because the improvements have been so enormous, and people keep thinking that we have more and more in the way of problems. You know, we have more and more causes of cancer, causes of heart disease, more violence and so on. Whereas actually the overall picture is that things are getting better, and they've got better to an enormous extent during the 20th century, despite some fairly terrible things having happened. So, I will take these three age ranges. First, I will say, at the moment, how many deaths in these age ranges do we see? Well, if we take the world in 2010, well, in 2010 there were about 53 million deaths. And 30 million of those deaths were before age 70, so 30 million deaths at ages So 30 million deaths at ages 0 to 69. And you can remember that figure because it will not change for the next 10, 20 years. Because although the death rates are going down, the population is rising, and at the moment, these things are approximately cancelling each other out. And so the total number of deaths will be, before 70, will be about 30 million in 2010, 2020 and 2030. It will stay approximately constant because increasing population is being counterbalanced by decreasing death rates. So in 2010, there were 7, I can't see the screen, the slides are quite simple, you can see what's on them anyway. In early childhood, there were about 7 million deaths in 2010. That is a loss of child deaths, but it is much lower than the number would have been in 1960. At ages 5 to 34, there were about 5 million deaths. And then at ages 35 to 69, there were about 18 million deaths, because we're then getting into the time when you start getting death from cancer, from vascular disease, from chronic respiratory disease. And then in old age, there are 23 million deaths. That number will increase enormously as the number reaching old age increases. So even though the death rates at any particular age are going down, the number of deaths in old age is going to rise. But anyway, I want to consider the red numbers, the numbers of premature deaths, the number of deaths before age 70. And I want to start by looking back 100 years. I want to look at the last century. And I'm going to use, as an example, the last century in Britain. I want to look at mortality rates in England at the death rates of 1910, at the death rates of 1960, and at death rates of 2010. And I want you just to remember the risks of death by age 5 and the risks of death by age 70. Okay, the bottom line is mortality at the death rates of 1910. So if the death rates of 1910 had continued, had not changed at all, then that bottom line is the survival pattern we would see. And you could see at the death rates of 1910, about 1 in 6 would have died before 5 years of age. And only 1 in 3 would survive to age 70. 2/3 would die before age 70. Okay, now 1910 is before we have any antibiotics. We have already had a considerable improvement. Already there has been a protection against sewage and introduction of cleaner water in Britain. But by 1960, suddenly most of that mortality in childhood and a lot of the mortality in early adult life has gone. So when we go to 1960, the probability of death in early childhood is only 4%. And you can see that about 90% of the population are still alive at age 50. But still, this is the males. About half are dead before 70. But if you look at 2010, then the probability of dying in the first 5 years of life is about 0.5%. It's about 0.5%. And the probability of dying before age 70 is only 21%, and in women it was even less. These are the male risks. In women it was about 16%. So overall, taking men and women together, you would have 18%, about 1 in 6, dying before 70. So instead of having 2/3 dead before 70, you would have about 1 in 6 dead before 70. So there's been an enormous change. And so in Britain now, premature death is uncommon. Death before 70 is uncommon. Still, pretty well everybody will die before the age of 100. We will not get a big change in the probability of death before age 100. And I don't know whether... And when you get to age 100, anyway, the mortality rate is about 50% per year. So of those who do get to 100, half are dead before they get to 101. And if you say, if I get to 100, what is the probability of living to 110? Well, if you have 50% dead per year, then only 1 in 1,000 who reaches 100 will reach 110. 1 in 2 to the 10. So there's a very small probability of living to 110. When you reach age 100, your life expectancy is only 1 year. So we're not going to fill up the world with people who are more than 100 years old. But we will have substantial increases in the number who are in their 70s or in their 80s, who are still alive in their 70s or 80s. Okay, and the big reason for the decrease in mortality between 1960 and 2010 is the big decrease in death from tobacco. In 1960, British men had the worst death rates in the world from tobacco, and since then we have had the best decrease in tobacco deaths in the world. It's very easy to have the best decrease in tobacco deaths in the world if you start off with the worst death rates. So now we have male and female mortality is really very similar. There is still a 4 years difference. Males have 4 years lower median survival than females. But really now that the risks of death from tobacco and also deaths from violence are reduced, overall we have 18% surviving until age 70. And we have life expectancy of only 1 year at age 100. Okay, so this is the changes over the last 100 years, and you see the changes have been very large. And what happened in Britain in the first half of the century happened worldwide in the second half of the century. Ever since 1950, the people have tried, the United Nations have tried to estimate mortality patterns in different countries. They've got reasonable estimates from about 1950 onwards, not so reliable, but from about 1970 onwards, the estimates become much more reliable. And from 1970 to 2010, over that 40-year period from 1970 to 2010, we've got quite good estimates for the largest countries in the world of how the death rates have changed. And here you can see, just for under 5 mortality, back at 1950 death rates, about a quarter of the children would have died before the age of 5. At 1970 death rates, 14% would die before age 5. And 1990 is 9%, and now it's only 5% dying before the age of 5. So the death rate, the under 5 mortality rate now, worldwide, is about 1/5 of what it was in 1950. There has been an enormous improvement. And in Mexico, actually in 1970, the under 5 mortality rate would have been a little bit less than 14%, only just over 10%. And now in 2010, it's more like about 4%. Actually, about 3%. And so we've got this change. This is a change for the world as a whole. Rich countries, poor countries, and middle-income countries. Now that trend, I want now to look at the trends from 1970 to 2010 in lots of other countries. So here is the world as a whole. This is essentially showing what I've just shown you for Britain, but it's turned upside down. So here we start off with, at the left, everybody is alive, and at the top right, everybody is dead. This is plotting the proportions dead against age. And at the left, the top line is at the death rates of 1970, and the bottom line is at the death rates of 2010 for the world. And at the left, you can see what you saw in the previous slide, 14% under 5 mortality versus 5% under 5 mortality. And over at age 70, so that is, well, it's there. This green thing doesn't work very well. Give up. But where it says 54%, that says that at global death rates of 1970, 54% would die before age 70. And worldwide, at the global death rates of 2010, only 36% will die before age 70. That's a very big change. It's a reduction of 1/3 already. And if you look at 1970, you can see a vertical dotted line going through it. And if you look very hard, you may be able to see two little red crosses, one at the top, one at the bottom. And that shows what was happening in England in 2010, so in England in 1910, and in England in 2010. So in England in 1910, taking males and females together, you've got more than 60% dead before age 70, so worse than the world in 1970. But if you go to England in 2010, that is the lower red cross, that's the bottom of that line going through age 70, we have 18% dead. So instead of 36% of the world as a whole, we have 18%. So halving premature death for the world as a whole would take the global average down to the British average of 2010. And that sounds a bit ambitious. Can we get the average for the world as a whole to be as low as the average for the United Kingdom? Yes, at present. And I think the answer is that we can. And I think the answer is that we could do it by sometime like the late 2030s or say 2040. I think that's a realistic timescale if we take the big causes of death seriously. Because pretty nearly everywhere we are seeing substantial improvements. Now, I cannot show you every country, but I can show you, I've shown you here the whole world, and I will show you this now in a slightly different format. I want to look at the probability of a child dying before age 5. Then I want to look at the probability that a 5-year-old will die before age 50. And then I want to look at the probability that a 50-year-old will die before age 70. So again, I'm going to show these same mortality patterns, but in a slightly different way. So here, the blue line here starts at 1970. All these lines start at 1970 and end at 2010. And you can see this decrease from at 1940, 14% dead, down to only 5% dead now. This is the world as a whole. So that is the change over 40 years, 1970 to 2010. Over the same period, this red line shows the probability that a 5-year-old will die before age 50. And the risk has gone down from 17% down to 10%. And that slowing down there, that kink there, that is the HIV epidemic. If we had not seen the HIV epidemic, the decrease would have been even greater. And here we have the probability that a 50-year-old will die before 70. And that has gone down from 36% down to 24%. It's decreased by 1/3. People talk about the epidemic of non-communicable disease. What we actually have is an epidemic of survival. The death rates among people of a given age are decreasing, and they are decreasing quite rapidly. So yes, we have more people reaching the age of 70. And so if you get more people reaching the age of 70, we're going to get more deaths among people aged 70. But at the same time, the death rates are going down very nicely. They're down even more now, so if I can see this green dot. Okay, but the black line is showing the decrease in mortality among people in their 50s and their 60s. Death rates are going down if we take the world as a whole, in each age range. Now, obviously, taking the world as a whole is a bit ridiculous. There are poor countries, there are rich countries, and there are middle-income countries. The World Bank classifies 1/6 of the world's population as living in poor countries, 1/6 living in high-income countries, and 2/3 in middle-income countries. So what are the trends like? And here we have, on the left, the same trends in low-income countries. And the bottom line is the blue. You can see this enormous reduction in under 5 mortality in poor countries. Each one of these lines starts at 1970 and finishes at 2010. Look, you can see the head is at 2010. They look like sperms swimming into the future. So, and in poor countries, you can see the huge effect of the HIV epidemic in Africa. So that orange line there, that showed you, but still, there is a big decrease in the probability that a 5-year-old will die before age 50. So the blue lines, there's lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income. You've got big decreases in child mortality in low income, in lower middle income, in upper middle income countries. And of course, in the high income countries, sure, the child mortality has gone down to about 1/6 of what it was, but it was already only about 3%, and now it's gone down to about 0.5%. So but the interesting one is the mortality at 50 to 69, the black lines. These decreases are similar for poor countries, middle-income countries, and rich countries. The absolute gain is very similar. So overall, it's a favourable picture. And then you may say, well, there are far too many upper middle-income countries, and they're very different from each other. I mean, Russia and Mexico may both be upper middle-income countries, but these are very different. The trends are very different, and they are. And the trouble is, there are 200 countries in the world, and they cannot draw 200 lines. But if we take the 25 most populous countries, 25 countries that are as big as, say, Britain or bigger, the 25 countries that have at least 1% of the world's population, well, those 25 countries in total include 75% of the world's population. Obviously, the biggest ones are India and China, and it goes all the way down. It would include Italy, it would not include Spain. So we can look at the trends in these 25 most populous countries. So I will start, and every time what I want to do is look at the change between 1970 and 2010. Okay, I'll start with the child mortality, the probability that a child will die before age 5. And here are the 25 trends. So, on the left, we have Congo, Nigeria, Ethiopia, the African countries, and in Congo, you can see there's been very little improvement over this 40-year period. And you can see that in Nigeria and Ethiopia, well, in the early years, there was serious war and disruption and famine, and then things stabilized. So there are real decreases. And if you look across here, in many of these countries, on the right, we have the developed countries of Europe, and the rates were already so low, and also we have Japan at the extreme right. The rates were already so low that they cannot go much lower. But everywhere else, we see substantial improvements. If you look, one of those striking changes is here in Egypt. This tall line here, starting at about 23% mortality and going down to 3% child mortality, is Egypt, just in 40 years, going from 23% under 5 mortality to 3%. And another striking line here, a striking high one, is Bangladesh, which starts from more than 20% under 5 mortality and is now at about 5% and still decreasing. So, if you look, here are the biggest countries. There's India, there's China. I mean, China's gone down from 10% under 5 mortality down to about, 2%, and actually they're claiming that now it's standing at 1% to the nearest whole number. So these are just enormous changes everywhere. This kick here in South Africa, this is because the HIV epidemic in South Africa was so extreme that it really halted the decrease in under 5 mortality. But as treatment improves, as the under 5s get treated, that decrease will resume. And here, just to point out, is Mexico, right next to China. Again, a very big decrease in the under 5 mortality in Mexico, from 12% down to about 2 or 3%. So overall, except where you've got either the effects of the HIV epidemic or total civil disruption, under 5 mortality has been improving substantially worldwide. And the changes are big, except where the rates are already low, but even there, the proportional changes are big. So the overall picture is favourable. Now, the picture, when I go to the next one, the probability that a 5-year-old will die before 50, the picture is again favourable, but much more heterogeneous. So here, at the left, we see the dreadful situation in South Africa, where decrease in mortality got completely reversed by the HIV epidemic. And this is for male and female together. If you looked at females separately, they would be even worse. And here, you see Congo, Nigeria, and beside that, Ethiopia, where really there's been much less progress than there should have been due to continuing civil disruption. This little one down here is Russia. So the next one here is Russia. I will come to that. And then this extraordinary one in the middle is Iran. So Iranian mortality rates would have been decreasing, but Iran got invaded by Iraq in the 1980s, and 1 million men got killed. If you plot this line separately for male and female, for the females there is just steady progress to lower mortality in Iran, but for the males that spike would be twice as high, because pretty nearly all of the people killed when Iraq invaded Iran were males. And this kink here, in the, well, I don't know how to point to it because I can't see the screen spot, I'm sure you can't. But this kink here is Thailand, and I was thinking that that also would be HIV, as it is in South Africa. But it's partly HIV, but it's also due to an extraordinary increase in deaths from external causes, particularly traffic accidents and violence. And Thailand has the highest death rate on the roads of any country in the world. And there's a lot of motorcycle use, there's a lot of drinking, drug use, and the combination of drink and motorcycles is really lethal. It becomes a major cause of death. Okay, but the overall picture again, except there is a local disaster, like civil conflict or HIV, the overall picture is favourable, except in Russia. And over here in Russia, I'll come back to Russia later, but the adverse trends in Russia are due to the increase in deaths from alcohol following the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'll come to that in a minute. Okay, there's India, the United States and China. And look, actually China, these points are all sorted according to the 2010 death rate. And actually taking males and females together, China now has a slightly lower death rate than the United States. And in terms of the probability that a 5-year-old will die before age 50. And here is Mexico, right next to the United States. It's obviously a mistake to be right next to the United States. Okay, now, if I go back to Mexico, you might think, well look, what are we seeing? Are we just seeing improvement in Mexico? We read all the time about the terrible numbers of deaths from murder in parts of Mexico. Not all parts of Mexico, but some parts of Mexico that are really affected by gang violence. How can it be that you are drawing smooth lines like that? Well, one part of it is that these are 5-year moving averages. So, the rate for 2010 is an average rate for 2005 to 2015. So there's a certain smoothing out. Also, it's looking at the whole of Mexico, not just the parts where you've got very high death rates. There are parts where really, this would not be an appropriate description of what is happening. But also, as well as the huge increase in deaths from murder in recent years in certain parts of Mexico, there has been quite a large decrease. So I want to take the Mexican data, and I want to look at the death rates at ages 15 to 34, 35 to 54, so really death in early adult life or early middle age. And here are the trends. This is now going single year by single year from 1975 to 2015, so moving on a little bit. The previous trends were 1970 to 2010. But on the left, you have the Mexican death rates of males and females from at ages 15 to 34. And you can see the absolute probabilities. You can see among females a fairly steady decrease with only a slight increase just towards the end, but nothing very much. And at 15 to 34 among the males, there was a peak around 1980, and then general progress, and then this increase in the period, say, 2005 to 2015, increase followed by a decrease. And it is a really serious increase. It is an increase that's producing, well, in the country as a whole, an increase of almost 1% in the probability of death. Probably that a 15-year-old will die before age 35, so it's even worse than that in the badly affected areas. I mean, it really is a disaster, but it's you've got to see it against a background of seriously decreasing mortality. I mean, even the amount of killing that has been taking place in various parts of Mexico hasn't changed the overall pattern, because the decreases are so large, the decreases due to other factors that are favourable. And when you move to the right, 35 to 54, then the increase, yes, there is an increase in deaths from violence, and also there was quite a high level of death from violence anyway. But still, it's not sufficient to change the overall favourable picture. So I'm not trying to pretend that nothing terrible is happening. And obviously the deaths from violence in eastern Congo are I don't know. They say that the war in Congo has now caused something like 5 million deaths. I don't know how true that figure is, but something like that. Anyway, the next thing I'd like to go to is, what is the probability that a 50-year-old will die before 70? And again, here are the top 25 countries, the biggest 25 countries in the world. Over on the left, the African countries, the Ethiopia over here. And apart from these countries where really you've got a lot of social disruption, there hasn't been much progress. Overall, the picture is surprisingly uniformly favourable. Here are India, China, the United States. And so despite the increasing epidemic of obesity, the decreasing mortality from smoking has had a greater effect so far than the increasing effects of obesity. And there is Mexico. Again, in Mexico you have, the main cause of premature death in Mexico now would be obesity, with diabetes as a consequence of obesity and various other things resulting from that, renal disease, vascular disease, and even an increase in the incidence of infection. But still, over the last 40 years, the net effect, when one looks over a period of some decades, is one of improvement rather than deterioration. And the striking exception for a time was Russia, where there was this enormous increase in deaths from alcohol following the collapse of the Soviet Union. But actually, in the last 10 years in Russia, so between the period 2005 and 2015, although the death rates in Russia are still high, they've actually been falling since 2005. This graph doesn't show that enormously well because it's averaging periods out. If you look at single-year grants to Russia, yes, the rates are still horribly high, but there has been progress over the last 10 years. And we did study in Russia at a time when the death rates were still high, in the early 2000s. And we just took 60,000 dead adults, and we knocked on the door, to ask the family, what did the dead person drink? And, if you want to know what a Russian man drinks, then you should ask his wife after he has died, and she will tell you. He used to drink 3 bottles of vodka at a time when he was drinking, or something like that. And we could do a rather crude case-control study of what is the death rate among men who drink average 1 bottle a day and the men who drink less than 1 bottle a week. We had less than 1 bottle a week as controls because there were no non-drinkers. And we found that if we compared 1 bottle of vodka a day versus less than 1 bottle of vodka a week, well, the drinkers had 4 times the risk of death from traffic accident. They had 6 times the death rate through other accidents. They had 8 times the probability of committing suicide, and they had 10 times the probability of being murdered. Partly because drunk people are annoying, and partly because they hang around with other drunk people. It's dangerous. In fact, among the women, there were not so many women who were drinking a bottle of vodka a day, but among them, there was a 15-fold relative risk of suicide and a 20-fold relative risk of being murdered. So these are terrible numbers, and there were also gross excesses of various other conditions, death from what they put down as heart disease, where people sometimes just die while drunk. If you take 2005 death rates, and you said, what is the probability of death before age 55? In Britain, at 2005 death rates, it was 7%. So if the men in Britain were 7% would die before age 55, and it's smoking and drinking, and it should have been 4%, not 7%, but it was 7%. But at the same time, the probability of Russian man would die before age 55 was 37%. So it's 37% instead of 7%. And since 2005 in Russia, it's decreased down to 25%, so it's a reduction of 1/3. And it has been said, Putin has said that he wants to actually produce circumstances where Russian men don't die, where you don't have these high death rates among Russian men. And there is acceptance by the Russian government that this really needs effective action against excessive drinking and also against deaths from smoking. And if they could really get deaths from vodka, it's vodka rather than other drinks, and from cigarettes down, then you could perfectly well have West European death rates in Russia by the 2030s. It's perfectly attainable, but you've got to take the big causes seriously. And big causes in Russia are particularly spirits and also cigarettes. So overall, the world's getting better. There are a few big causes which have got substantially worse in some countries over the last 25 years. But overall, since 1990, there's been, tobacco, for example, China, HIV, for example, Africa, alcohol, for example, Russia, adiposity, for example, Mexico, war, many examples. Then these big causes of death have changed substantially since 1990 in some large populations. But overall, things are getting better. It's where you've got local big problems, but overall, death rates are going down in the world, not up. So when we say, can we halve the mortality that remains, we're saying, can we continue the trends that we've seen over the last few decades, on average? So to come back to these numbers, death in early childhood, death at ages 5 to 34, death at ages 35 to 69, can we halve these risks? Well, just consider childhood and early adult life briefly, and then I'll mainly discuss mortality at ages 35 to 69. So there are 7 million deaths a year at ages 0 to 4. 2 million of them are death in the process of being born. Perinatal deaths, neonatal deaths. And actually, if you include the late stillbirths of children who are perfectly viable, but who actually die before being born alive, there would be another 2 million. So if one included the late stillbirths, that would be 4 million. The total would be 9 million deaths at ages 0 to 4, with 4 million of them perinatal, neonatal. And for this, you really do need competent people with the mother at the time of delivery. It doesn't have to be a third-tier hospital, but it does need to be birth attendants who actually know what they're doing in terms of dealing with sudden emergencies that can happen. But the good news is that these death rates have been going down sharply worldwide, and so can these be halved? Yes. Then, to the nearest million, 1 million deaths from acute respiratory disease, 1 million from diarrhea, 1 million from malaria. Actually, in each case now, it's slightly less than 1 million. But if I were going back to 1990, it would be 3 million deaths from acute respiratory disease, pneumonia, 2 million from diarrhea, and more than 1 million from malaria. These numbers have gone down very substantially. A lot of it's been because of international action, working with governments, where you've got collaboration between international agencies, international aid, and governments trying to take child mortality seriously. Then you can actually get progress, and it's been that sort of combination that has really achieved these. And of course, vaccination has had a lot to do with it. In fact, deaths from vaccine-preventable diseases of childhood decreased by 2/3 in a single decade between year 2000 and year 2010. In year 2000, the world adopted the Millennium Development Goals, one of which was really taking vaccination seriously. The Gates Foundation set up the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunisation, which rapidly grew bigger and bigger, and basically people started to take vaccination. They were already taking it seriously, but they took it even more seriously. And we're really trying to work out where can we get the vaccination rates up. And the result has been, just in 10 years, between 2000 and 2010, a reduction of 2/3 in death from vaccine-preventable diseases of early childhood. Is wonderful. And, malaria deaths, a bit over 500,000 now, but, as I say, it would have been 1.5 million back at 1990 death rates. But again, it's been international collaboration and actually getting drugs that work to be given in time. Every malaria death is preventable if the person is treated with cheap drugs. When they've got serious fever, and every one of the malaria deaths is a failure. It's a failure to give cheap drugs. So yes, these death rates have been falling. Childhood death rates have been falling faster than anything else, and can continue falling as long as there isn't civil disruption, and as long as there continues to be international aid, international collaboration, working with governments. When you go to the next age range, 5 to 34, 5 million deaths, 2 million of these are for injuries, accident, violence, suicide. And of course, these are much more difficult to do things about. But accident, suicide, there's enormous variation in suicide rates between different parts of India, between different parts of China, between past and the present. There are time trends, big time trends in suicide rates in many countries. And this does say that suicide, you may not be able to prevent a particular person committing suicide, but you can do things that will actually affect the national suicide rates. About 1 million HIV disease, well, that's going down with treatment. Then 2 million from various other diseases. The methods that will be needed to halve mortality in early adult life are different, but it can be done. Deaths from violence, this is again something that's a societal effect, has a big effect on, and it would vary enormously. And as people here in Mexico know very well. Then, when you get to middle age, Still, because I'm going down to 35, there's still some HIV deaths in here. There's still, but if you look, 9 million of those 18 million deaths are vascular disease, heart disease, stroke, or cancer. And another 4 million would be other non-communicable diseases. Renal disease is particularly important in Mexico, diabetes and renal disease, and chronic obstructive lung disease, emphysema. So 3/4 of these deaths are deaths from non-communicable disease. Still, you've got quite a lot of deaths from communicable disease, mainly TB, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. And again, TB treatment plans work. Where you actually get TB drugs to be given, you can get the TB death rate down. And so the TB death rate has been going down due to organised collaboration, again, between international agencies and governments. And again, injuries, I mean, not so much, it's mostly accidents, really, when you get into later middle age. Again, accidents, accidental death rates vary greatly. Traffic death rates vary enormously from one society to another, and there are things that can be done to halve traffic mortality rates where they're high. So yes, death rates, mortality from communicable diseases and from injury can be reduced, has been being reduced, and can be reduced. But if we're going to actually reduce death from non-communicable disease, then we've got to deal seriously with vascular mortality and cancer mortality. So can we halve them? That's the final question. Can we halve vascular mortality and cancer mortality? Well, in Britain, Britain's a good example of vascular mortality decreasing. And it's been both treatment and prevention. The most important aspect of prevention has been a big reduction in cigarette smoking. Lots of people who smoked stopped, and now there's much lower cessation rates. So we've had a big reduction in vascular disease due to tobacco. But we've also had huge changes in medication. The ability to give, back in 1970, there were virtually no drugs that worked. We've got antihypertensive drugs, we didn't have good evidence that they worked, we didn't have good antihypertensive regimens. We've got a much wider range of drugs for vascular disease, and we know about antithrombotics and so on, but actually they're not being used, they're still not being used as widely as they should be. But here's the United Kingdom as a good example of what can be done. So the red crosses are the average for male and female. The top is male vascular mortality from 1950, 1970, 1990, 2010, and the bottom is female. And the main reason for the divergence between the different shapes is because men got badly affected by tobacco long before women did. But the red cross in 1980, in the middle of the picture, that is the average of male and female in 1980, and it represents 16% dead before age 70 from vascular disease. At the lower right, the red cross in the lower right is also the average between male and female, and this is the probability of dying from vascular disease at 2010 death rates. So it's gone down from 16% to 4%. Vascular mortality in Britain went down to a quarter of what it was. There was a fourfold reduction over a 30-year period due to reduction in the hazards, the effects of tobacco, and the development and deployment of drugs that work. And the key ones are all out of patent now. These are not expensive drugs necessarily, the ones that matter. There are good statins, there are good blood pressure lowering drugs, there are good antithrombotic drugs that are no longer patented. And one needs to get methods of ensuring that they're given. And in Britain, unfortunately, for Mexico, the management of diabetes is perhaps better in Britain than in Mexico, and it really shows up in the national death rates. Now, if we're going to get drugs used, we really need to treat the people who are at high risk of losing a lot. If you're 90 years old, well, you're not really at high risk of losing a lot because you're 90 and you haven't got much left anyway. And if you're 30 and you're at very low risk of anything happening in the near future. You're not at great risk. But if you're, say, 60 or 70, and if you've got some risk factors, and particularly if you've already had a heart attack or stroke, then you're at high risk of having another one. If you've still got a good quality of life, then get drugs used that work. You can reduce vascular mortality rates easily to a third of what they would otherwise be, just by using generic statins, generic blood pressure lowering drugs, just aspirin. You know, really, if you take people who still have a good quality of life, so secondary prevention, this is practicable in high income and particularly in the cities anyway, middle income populations. But you need organisation to make it happen. So the aim is to treat high risk, not just high blood pressure or high cholesterol, which gives you greater absolute benefit in primary prevention. And you don't need a screening programme to find who to treat. You don't have to medicalise apparently well individuals. So I think we can do this, and if we get this working well for secondary prevention, then it will extend to primary prevention. You know, you'll say, well, okay, you're at quite high risk, even though you haven't yet had an episode, you can treat such people. So in this context, I would take somebody who has diabetes as already being a patient, and so we come into what I call the secondary prevention category. So I think the emphasis, we need to get the drugs that work to be affordably available and used. And there's no reason why statins have to be 10 times as expensive, why generic statins have to be 10 times as expensive in China as in India. Indians have perfectly good statins, and they're 10 times less expensive than in China. I mean, these things should not be. If you want to, you need to get affordable generics used. We need to get economic incentives right to use them. Okay, what about causes? Well, 4 big modifiable causes of vascular mortality. And I'll do about one slide for each cause: tobacco, blood pressure, blood lipids, and adiposity. So tobacco, we've got the Million Women study. This is the biggest study of vascular disease this century. And here we have, on the left, coronary heart disease, on the right, stroke. We've got the relative risk versus the number of cigarettes you smoke. And even if a woman smokes just 5 or 10 cigarettes a day, she's got 3.2 times the risk of dying from coronary heart disease in middle age. An average smoker, 15 a day, has 4 times the risk of a non-smoker. And for stroke, on the right-hand side, you can see the increase in stroke risk with smoking. And these relationships are causal, and if people stop smoking, then the risk rapidly goes down. Not the risk of a non-smoker, but much, much lower than the risk of a smoker. So that's done tobacco in one slide, and obviously the same is true in men. What about blood pressure? Well, in this audience there will be people whose average blood pressure is 110, 130, 150, and every 20 millimetres systolic blood pressure makes a 2-fold difference in vascular mortality. Now, you can't easily put people on drugs that will reduce blood pressure by 20 millimetres, but it is easy to get regimens that will reduce blood pressure by 10 millimetres. So a 10 millimetre reduction in blood pressure reduces risk by about 30%. What about blood lipids? Well, if you take something like atorvastatin, which is a generic, I'm talking about generic atorvastatin. I'm not trying to plug any drug company's drugs. There are many other drugs that work. But this, you could reduce LDL cholesterol by about 2 millimoles per litre. Or you use different units here, so that would be about 80 milligrams per deciliter. And this will reduce vascular risk by about 40%. Non-vascular mortality is not adversely affected, so total mortality goes down accordingly. But many people, you do surveys of people with a history of occlusive stroke, with a history of minor heart disease, who still have a good quality of life. So many of them are not on a statin. They're not on anything to reduce blood pressure. Okay, what about adiposity? Well, if you are overweight, then 10 units of BMI, I mean, my BMI is about 23. If my BMI was 33, then I would have twice the risk of a mild stroke. But that's actually very difficult to make a difference as big as that in blood pressure. If somebody has a BMI of 33, well, 10% weight loss would take it down to 30. 20% weight loss would take it down. Well, it's difficult to achieve 20% weight loss. So, yes, it would be a good idea not to become overweight or obese. Yes, it would be a good idea to lose a bit of weight, but one's got to be practical about what is possible. And again, medication can limit these risks. Now, Mexico in particular has a reason to be concerned with medication, because one of the complications of adiposity is its increased blood pressure, adverse changes in blood cholesterol, but also diabetes. Now, Mexico has more diabetes than in the United States. You have similar levels of adiposities. But what you have is slightly more diabetes, but you've got much greater mortality per diabetic. And because the risks per diabetic are so great, diabetes is a cause of about 1/3 of all Mexican mortality in Mexico City, ages 35 to 74. So the Mexican City prospective study, 150,000 Mexican adults interviewed about 20 years ago and followed up. How does the baseline diabetes predict risk? The relative risk is 4. Diabetic versus not at baseline. The mortality rate ratio is 4. It should not be as extreme as that. When you look at the blood glucose, or actually glycosylated hemoglobin, it's much too high. The glucose is not being adequately controlled. The drugs that are needed are not expensive, but they do need to be given. But still, I say what is bad, but I come back to the overall thing. Total adult mortality rates are still falling, although they are slowing in Mexico and in the United States. So this is results from the Mexico City prospective study, and it just shows you how strongly baseline diabetes is related to the risk of death to various diseases. Well, renal disease, everybody knows. Cardiac, death through infection. This is underemphasised, but diabetics have substantially elevated risks of death from infection. Obviously, death from acute diabetic crisis. Deaths from stroke. You know, just excesses of many of the common causes of death. And what one needs, yes, it would be better not to have the adiposity in the first place. You'd better not have the type 2 diabetes, but if it is there, then it needs to be managed. Okay, cancer. I'll do cancer quite quickly now, so I'm rather short on time. Treatment and prevention. Here is breast cancer mortality from 1950 to 2010 in the United Kingdom and the United States. And suddenly, in the 1980s, treatment started to be used that worked, and breast cancer death rates have dropped. They would have kept on rising, because breast cancer is a disease of development, but instead they've dropped to less than half of what they are. So the probability of death from breast cancer before age 70 in the US now is 1.1%, in the UK now it is 1.2%. In Mexico it is 0.9%, because you started at such low rates and you never got the increase that was seen in the United Kingdom and United States, because the development came later. It would have happened, but it didn't happen, and the increase that was taking place in Mexico, this is Mexican breast cancer death rates, the increase that was taking place during the 1970s never got anywhere near as high as the United States, and then it has levelled off because of the treatment of breast cancer in Mexico, and it's now at 0.9% compared to 1.1% in the US, 1.2% in the UK. So what's happened is that the introduction of treatments that work in Mexico has avoided that huge increase in breast cancer death that was seen in Britain and America by 1980 ever happening. And cervix cancer in the middle there in Mexico, it was rising, and then since 1990 it's gone down due to better diagnosis, better treatment. On the right, you've got lung cancer in Mexico. The top is males due to cigarettes, the bottom is females. And part of that increase in the 1970s to the 1980s might be artifactual due to better ascertainment of causes of death, but the decreases are real, and particularly the decrease among males is real. There's been quite a lot of smoking cessation. Actually, Mexicans do not smoke anywhere near as much as the British and the Americans used to. So you've got something like 0.25% female, 0.5% male risk of death from lung cancer before age 70, which is much lower. It's about 1/5 as high as in the United States. Here's the United States female risk at the top is lung cancer, 1.5%. Remember, in Mexico, it's 0.25%. Few women smoke in Mexico, and those who do don't smoke very much. Breast cancer we've already seen, colorectal cancer going down, especially due to better treatment since 1990. Uterine cancer decreased due to screening and decreasing causes are levelling off now. And stomach decreased for reasons that we just don't know. Stomach actually goes down with development. US and UK stomach cancer rates are much lower than those in Mexico. In Mexico, the stomach cancer rates are decreasing, but they're still about 5 times higher than the US, UK. Now, on a different scale, here's the... On a different scale, here's the male trends. Now, the scale is completely different, because if I've done it on the same scale as the females, then I'd have to go right off the top of the page to get the lung cancer. But you can see the extent to which US mortality trends, cancer mortality trends, are dominated by first the rise and then the fall in lung cancer mortality. And that's true in the US, it's even more true in the UK. So in the US, if we look on the left here in this picture, the left is US males, and the shallow, steady decrease is what US male cancer death rates should have been if nobody had ever smoked. And the hump, which is added to it, is the US male cancer mortality added from smoking. And on the right, you have the same thing for females. Okay, now, that's it. My time is up. The conclusion on this, if I want to summarise, is that overall things are getting better. We can keep it. Just come back again. Okay. Mr. Chair, can you advise me, should I talk for about 2 more minutes to sum up, or what? Or should I'll do whatever you say. Okay. Things are getting better, but we need to take the big causes seriously. In Britain and America, the biggest cause is smoking, followed by obesity. In Mexico, obesity, followed by smoking. In Russia, it would be alcohol, followed by smoking. And in various places, HIV. But these are all targets that we can go for. We could realistically hope that at death rates of 2040, world mortality rates will be as low as the mortality rates in Britain now are, if only we can avoid some new disaster, if we can avoid some total failure of society, some massive new epidemic. But if we keep going, then overall, we've got a better and better chance of avoiding death before age 70. But still, pretty well everybody's going to be dead by the time they're 100, if they're not. Other people wish they were. Thank you very much.